Hello and welcome to Inside Europe, the weekly current affairs podcast and radio programme from DW, Germany's international broadcaster. I'm Kate Laycock in Bonn. This week on the show, GPS jamming, how worried should Europe be? And pipeline wars, what the bombing of Russian oil infrastructure means for Hungary. Then we'll be taking a look ahead to next week's confidence vote in France. Could this be the end of François Bayrou's government? And also to general elections in Norway, where the country's sovereign wealth fund is once again at the centre of discussions. All those stories and more coming up here on Inside Europe. This week, our roundup of European news is presented by Nick Martin.
Some 30 leaders held talks with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Paris on Thursday. On the agenda, future security guarantees to Kyiv if there's a ceasefire with Russia. The summit, both in person and virtually, of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, was made up mostly of European leaders, together with the leaders of Turkey, Australia and Canada. On Wednesday, while hosting Poland's new nationalist president, Karol Nawrocki, at the White House, US President Donald Trump had offered to send more troops to Poland, which is worried that the war in Ukraine could spill over its border. President Trump also hinted at taking stronger action against Russia if it fails to end the war it began with its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Belgium has become the latest Western country to say it will recognise the state of Palestine at the UN General Assembly this month, following similar announcements by Australia, Canada and France. In a post on X, Belgian Foreign Minister Maxime Prevot said that the decision came in view of the humanitarian tragedy unfolding in Gaza, adding that firm sanctions are being imposed against the Israeli government. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responded by calling his Belgian counterpart a weak leader, despite mounting pressure at home and abroad to end its nearly 2-year campaign in Gaza. Israel has recently been stepping up operations as it lays the groundwork for seizing Gaza City, where the UN has declared a man-made famine. A flotilla of around 20 ships manned by civilian activists from 44 different countries is currently attempting to break Israel's blockade of the Palestinian territory and deliver much-needed food and medical supplies. This week, hundreds of people turned out for the funeral of former Ukrainian Parliament Speaker and prominent pro-Western politician Andrei Parubi, who was gunned down in the street last weekend. Crowds gathered in the sweltering heat in the city of Lviv to see Parubi's coffin carried in procession to a ceremony in the central square, before being buried in a cemetery which has traditionally been the resting place of the city's most renowned figures. The 54-year-old Parubi was a lawmaker who had participated in Ukraine's Orange Revolution in 2004. He also led self-defense volunteer units during the Maidan protests of 2014 and was Parliamentary Speaker from 2016 to 2019. Parubi is survived by his wife and daughter. French authorities are bracing for a day of nationwide protests led by far-left activists next week, with intelligence officials warning the movement's decentralised nature makes its scale and impact difficult to predict. The broad anti-government campaign, dubbed Bloc on Tout, Let's Block Everything, has urged a shutdown of France on September the 10th, with a string of protest actions and civil disobedience around the country. France's leaders are also facing a political crisis, with a confidence vote in the National Assembly set for September the 8th. The vote, which Prime Minister François Bayrou triggered in the hopes of forcing backing for his controversial austerity budget plans, is one he is widely expected to lose. If that happens, the Prime Minister and his government will be forced to resign. And finally, there was good news for European industry this week, with private surveys showing Eurozone activity expanded for the first time since mid-2022, as domestic demand offset the impact from US tariffs. Greece and Spain led the growth, while manufacturing in Germany, the bloc's largest economy, shrank, but at a slower pace than previously. In contrast, Britain, which is no longer part of the European Union, saw factory activity suffer a fresh setback amid worries about trade tensions and tax increases at home.
Nick Martin with that roundup of European news recorded on Thursday, 4th of September. For more up-to-date headlines and analysis from a European perspective, you can go to dw.com or download DW's Breaking World News app. This is Inside Europe, and I'm Kate Laycock in Germany. As we went to studio this week, European leaders were gathering in Paris for Coalition of the Willing talks aimed at finalising security guarantees for Ukraine. It seemed fitting then to begin with a security story. But security stories aren't just about battle lines and troops on the ground. Sometimes they're about something as intangible as a GPS signal. A GPS signal which gets jammed. One of the big security stories of the week has been the fallout from an incident last weekend when an EU Commission-chartered plane on a tour of frontline states reportedly lost access to GPS signals while approaching a Bulgarian airport. Was it Russian jamming? If so, the target couldn't have been more high profile. On board the plane, EU Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen. Our security correspondent, Terry Schultz, has been looking into the issue of GPS interference, which has been a topic of long-standing concern, particularly for countries on Europe's eastern flank.
After European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen's plane was reportedly forced to delay its landing in Bulgaria due to sudden and suspicious navigation problems, it elevated complaints about this behavior that had long been building in Eastern European countries and the Baltic states. Ariana Podesta is a European Commission spokesperson.
We are, of course, aware and used to the threats and intimidations that are a regular component of Russia's hostile behavior.
The flight was able to land safely with the pilots using other means of navigation.
Moscow denies it had anything to do with the GPS interference.
But Podesta said the incident demonstrated the urgency of the mission von der Leyen was on, talking up EU defense capabilities in countries along the EU's eastern border.
There she has seen firsthand the everyday challenges of threats coming from Russia and its proxies. And of course, the EU will continue to invest into defense spending and in Europe's readiness even more after this incident.
There's been a huge increase in the number of times flight or ship navigation systems have been hindered by either jamming of the signals or spoofing, sending purposely inaccurate data that can endanger them. Anna-Kaisa Itkinen is the Commission's spokesperson on transportation matters.
There was a letter sent by 13 member states to the Commission in June this year, and they drew our attention additionally to this issue, which is something that is becoming almost a daily practice. It has serious impacts on maritime and aviation, and obviously with economic impacts as well.
Among the countries signing that letter she mentioned is Lithuania. Its air traffic control company said pilots reported 1,022 incidents of navigation interference in June alone, a more than 2,000% increase from a year earlier when there were 46. Vesela Chernova is the Deputy Director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, based in Sofia, Bulgaria. She says this meddling with navigation can go much further.
Russia has the capability to interfere in our air traffic, in our controlling systems, in critical infrastructures, ports, but also hospitals and so on and so forth. So this is why this whole line of defense, the defense in cyber, is extremely difficult, and preparedness and resilience are two words that are more and more on the minds of governments in Europe.
Chernova says the fact this time the target was the very top of the European Commission should be a wake-up call to take the activity seriously.
I hope in the end it's going to produce a EU policy that is going to contribute to the resilience of the countries, especially those here around the front line. And I'm not talking simply about GPS jamming, but about the plethora of possibilities for hybrid attacks that can really undermine citizens' security.
After the incident, Defense Commissioner Andrius Kubilius announced the bloc will deploy additional satellites to strengthen resilience against GPS interference and will also improve capabilities to detect the attacks. Kubilius happened to be on a plane with von der Leyen. While he was in office, former Lithuanian Foreign Minister Gabrielius Landsbergis tried to raise the alarm about these incidents and to raise the cost for Moscow. Landsbergis suggests things are not moving in the right direction, with Russia having just also damaged the EU diplomatic mission in Kyiv a few days ago.
Russians are getting bolder. The GPS jamming and an attack on EU representation in Kyiv show that EU strategy, hiding from Russia behind Ukrainian or American backs, is no longer viable. And if Europe is not ready to stand up, it will only get worse.
NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte says in the alliance, they are standing up against the interference.
I can assure you that we are working day and night to counter this, to prevent it, and to make sure that they will not do it again.
Never again may be an unrealistically high bar in a short time, but at least after the von der Leyen incident, it's the goal. Terry Schultz, DW, Brussels.
From satellite to energy infrastructure now. Tensions are running high between Hungary and Ukraine after Kyiv bombed a Russian oil pipeline, which Hungary depends on for a considerable amount of its energy needs. Now, yes, there is an EU embargo on Russian oil imports, and yes, Hungary is a member of the EU, but it obtained exemptions which have allowed it to continue and, in fact, deepen its reliance on Russian fossil fuels. As a result, infrastructure damage within Russia is of massive concern to Viktor Orban and the Hungarian government. I spoke to our Budapest correspondent Stefan Boss about the government's reaction.
Hungary has announced that a senior Ukrainian officer, his name is Robert Brovdi, also known as Magyar here, and basically what Hungary decided, that he will be barred from entering Hungary and the entire Schengen zone, which is the free travel area within many European countries. The interesting thing in this is that Brovdi is an ethnic Hungarian, so he belongs to the Hungarian minority in Ukraine, and he is also a Ukrainian citizen. And now he heads the Ukraine's unmanned systems forces and basically oversaw the recent attack on the Druzhba pipeline, which means, by the way, Druzhba means friendship pipeline, which supplies more than half of Hungary's oil imports. Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has condemned Hungary's decision to ban the officer who led these strikes, and he called it an outrageous attempt to shift blame for the war onto Ukraine.
It's no secret, Stefan, that Volodymyr Zelensky and Viktor Orban are not exactly the best of buddies, but still, targeting a pipeline that was supplying over half of Hungary's oil needs, I mean, that's risky, isn't it? Because Hungary is still an EU member and as such can make life really quite difficult for Ukraine.
It's a very interesting question. I think, first of all, Ukraine has made it clear in general that it wants to ensure that Russia won't use energy revenues for its war effort. And of course, Russia is very much dependent on the revenues flowing from oil and natural gas. And that's why Ukraine is trying to stop that by targeting that infrastructure. However, President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine also suggested that the strikes were meant to pressure Hungary to support Ukraine's bid to join the European Union. This is what he said about that.
Ми завжди підтримували дружбу між Україною і Угорщиною. А тепер існування дружби залежить від позиції Угорщини.
Now, he's basically saying we have always supported the friendship between Ukraine and Hungary. Now, of course, he is referring to the pipeline. And he adds, and now the existence of friendship depends on the position of Hungary on EU membership. Now, those remarks led to an angry response from Hungary's foreign minister, Péter Szijjártó, who suggested that the Ukrainian president is behaving like the television comedian he once was before running for office.
Na most a barátság kőolajvezeték bombázása, rakétázása az nem Oroszországnak árt, hanem nekünk magyaroknak.
So the foreign minister is now saying that the bombing and rocketing of the Friendship oil pipeline is not damaging Russia, but us, Hungarians and Slovaks. And this is causing an uproar. It is disgusting, but this is what the Ukrainian president, a former actor, is doing. Now, and I can tell you also that the minister argued Ukraine knew the pipeline was vital for Hungary's and Slovakia's energy supply, and he warned that anyone threatening Hungary's energy security must expect consequences. Hungary has also made clear it will not be blackmailed and will use its veto to prevent Ukraine from ever joining the European Union. The government cites economic and security concerns, and it also claims that a state-organized public consultation in June showed about 95% of Hungarians who took part opposed Ukraine's EU accession. Now, Hungary, as well as Slovakia, which also suffers from Ukraine's attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, they both have asked the EU's executive body, the European Commission, to help them achieve energy security.
So how does the European Union stand then? Because, I mean, it's in a difficult position, isn't it? Because it's got to support Ukraine, but on the other hand, energy concerns within its member states are a real problem as well.
Yes, that's a very interesting point, because the European Commission, they have said that oil supply security have not yet been affected this time around due to stockpiled reserves, but they also stressed that critical infrastructure should be protected by all parties, and that was a clear reference to Ukraine as well. Now, I can tell you that tensions remain high between Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who is viewed increasingly as authoritarian by critics, and Brussels. Now, the EU leaders accuse his government of pursuing a pro-Moscow policy and say not enough has been done to diversify energy resources. And actually, Kiev is saying to the Hungarian Prime Minister, well, if you have complaints, complain to your friends in Moscow, because they started the war. Yet, for now, oil is flowing again from Ukraine, but the question remains how long the friendship, in more than one sense, will last.
Our Budapest correspondent, Stefan Boss there. That brings us to the end of our security section for this week. Next up, 2 reasons why September 8th is looming big on the European political calendar. That's here on Inside Europe with me, Kate Laycock, in Bonn. September 8th was already down in our Inside Europe diary as the date of Norwegian national elections. More on that later. Then came French Prime Minister François Bayrou's potentially fateful decision to call a confidence vote in his government for that same day. It was, he said, the only way of resolving the gridlock surrounding his controversial budget plans aimed at reducing France's national debt. But, as John Lawrenson reports from Paris, Bayrou's gamble looks likely to backfire. France has already had 3 different prime ministers over the past year. Is it about to lose another one?
C'est la raison pour laquelle j'ai demandé au président de la République de convoquer le Parlement.
There was, in François Bayrou's surprise announcement that he's putting the future of his government to a vote in Parliament, an echo of President Macron's surprise decision a year ago to call fresh parliamentary elections. Macron hoped he'd win renewed support from the people, but lost his relative majority in Parliament. Bayrou hoped he'd win a majority of deputies who, in his words, were ready to choose responsibility rather than chaos. In other words, back his controversial austerity budget plans. He knew the far left ecologists and socialists would probably vote against him because they oppose his budget cuts. He apparently hoped the far-right Rassemblement National would support him. But if that was the case, he was soon disappointed.
Il n'y a qu'une seule possibilité pour sortir de cette impasse politique dans la
Rassemblement National number 2, Jordan Bardella, said there was only one way to clear the current political roadblock, and that was fresh elections. It was Emmanuel Macron who got us into this situation, he said, so he must either dissolve Parliament or resign as president so that people can choose a new direction for the country. The risk for the Rassemblement National is that voting down the Bayrou government will increase scepticism about their ability to manage the economy. François Bayrou has staked his premiership on the issue of the debt. His plan to reduce the budget by 44 billion euros by measures including, most remarkably, getting rid of 2 bank holidays is aimed at getting France's 3.3 trillion euro debt under control. The Sorbonne University political philosopher Pierre-Henri Tavoyot saluted Bayrou's move for concentrating minds on the debt problem.
On a du mal en France à se mettre d'accord, pas simplement sur les mesures, mais sur...
Professor Tavoyot said it was difficult for the French not just to agree on the cures, but also the diagnosis. And the diagnosis, he said, was tragic. It is, he said, that because of the debt, France is losing its sovereignty, its ability to decide its own destiny in the world. Not in 10 years' time, but in a matter of months. The sense of Bayrou's no-confidence vote, and I think this is very intelligent, he said, is not to say, approve my measures, but let's agree on the gravity of the situation. Nevertheless, Bayrou's opponents on the left and far right are choosing not to understand it this way. They reject the plan he's putting forward. The socialists, for example, want a new wealth tax to pay for a lowering of the retirement age from 64 to 62. The Rassemblement National wants to reserve state benefits for French nationals to fund a lowering of the retirement age to 60. So, if Bayrou falls, what will happen next? The opinion polls say some 63% of the French want President Macron to dissolve Parliament again and call fresh elections. If he does that, other opinion polls show the Rassemblement National is way ahead of its adversaries at 33%. A coalition of the far left, centre-left and ecologists coming second at 25%. However, if the Rassemblement National's adversaries form a so-called cordon sanitaire against it, as it did last time, it is unlikely that new elections would change the makeup of the National Assembly very much. That is the opinion of Socialist Party leader Olivier Faure, in any case, who is calling for a different solution.
J'entends parler de dissolution.
After confirming that there's no way his party would support the Prime Minister in the no-confidence vote, Faure said that dissolution would solve nothing, as it would probably just produce another hung parliament. So we best make do with the parliament we have now, he said. France is not ungovernable, just badly governed, he said. He called for a Prime Minister from the left. He didn't say so directly, but himself, for example, who would govern from the left, seeking out parliamentary majorities for each piece of legislation, but with the aim of putting a left-wing programme in place. Faure's plan, it seems, has the favour of President Macron. The president dissolved Parliament once and doesn't fancy doing it again, and at the same time he's ruled out resignation. However, if a left-wing government is formed in the coming weeks, that government could very well be very short-lived. It is now very likely that France will have a new Prime Minister this month. It is also likely it'll have yet another one by Christmas. How many would that make for this year? People are starting to lose count. John Lawrenson, DW, Paris.
And you can bet your bottom euro that we will be returning to Paris next week after that vote. In the meantime, we have a preview of another big vote scheduled for September 8th, the Norwegian parliamentary elections. Now, political discourse in Norway is often rather different to that in other countries, in large part because whilst countries like France are worrying about where to save money, the debate in energy-rich Norway is usually about how to spend it. This election is no exception, with Norway's much-envied sovereign wealth fund at the heart of the political discussion. Here's Lars Bavanger with the details.
Så kommer det till att komma mest till gode de rikeste som...
One of the final party leader debates before Norwegians head to the polls on the 7th and the 8th of September. Very simply put, the disagreements centre on what pot of money should be spent on welfare services, tax the rich, cut taxes to encourage growth, or spend more oil money. It is jokingly said that all of Norway's political parties are social democrats because they all support a strong welfare state, but they do disagree on how it should be funded. Labour and other parties on the left want to maintain relatively high taxes, while the Conservatives and the populist Progress Party promise lower taxes, same welfare, counting on efficiency, private sector growth and, in the case of the Progress Party, using more oil money while also trimming some welfare programmes. Recently, the crux of the argument has been the so-called wealth tax, taxing assets like houses, shares and bank deposits. The left argues some of Norway's richest pay no or little income tax and should therefore pay tax on their wealth. The right says this pushes wealthy individuals to move abroad, which many have done. It is estimated that more than 100 Norwegian millionaires and billionaires now live in Switzerland. However, many Norwegian voters still have a strong sense of equality and don't like the idea of some people avoiding paying tax like normal people. Money, money, money. You'd have thought having 1.7 trillion euro in the bank should make governing Norway easy. Yet that very wealth fund, popularly known as the oil fund, has become a headache for politicians too. In recent months, it has emerged that the fund has invested in and made considerable gains from several Israeli firms that have directly contributed to the war in Gaza. After considerable public and political pressure, the fund has divested from 11 Israeli companies so far, in turn creating diplomatic tensions with Israel and its supporters like the USA. The Socialist Left Party, essential to a future Labour coalition, wants the fund to divest fully from Israel, yet Labour has resisted a complete withdrawal from investments there, and that is something parties on the right agree with. So, who's going to win come Monday night? Just under a year ago, nobody thought Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre from the Labour Party would manage to be re-elected. He was trailing Conservative opposition leader Erna Solberg by nearly 15% in popularity. But then two things happened. Labour's then coalition partner, the Agrarian Centre Party, left government because of deep disagreements over EU energy policy. This left Labour to run a minority government, yet it proved popular with traditional Labour voters and those on the fence. The Centre Party had held the finance minister position, and their departure allowed the PM to fill the vacancy with near universally popular Jens Stoltenberg, the former NATO Secretary General and also a former PM. The Labour Party is currently polling near 28%, and with support from the Socialist Left and the Greens, Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre might just secure a second term. Not that it would be easy. Not only do the smaller parties want to see action over Israeli investments and increases in the wealth tax, they also want to phase out the very source of Norway's wealth, oil and gas, far earlier than Labour, which wants to continue petroleum operations beyond 2050. Lars Bavanger, DW.
Before I sign off, I'd like to put in a quick word for our partners over at The World programme from GBH and PRX. Despite increasingly difficult conditions for publicly funded radio in the US, they continue to cover a fantastic array of stories from around the globe. This week, for example, Jerry Haddon reported from Barcelona on the launch of the global Sumud flotilla to Gaza, and future shows are expected to feature updates from one of the ships. You'll find The World wherever you get your podcasts. This is Inside Europe, and I'm Kate Laycock in Germany.
I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're with The World, Public Radio's leading global news program.
We cover the biggest news events developing every day and give you the context you need to make sense of them.
And Carolyn, I also like our smaller stories, tales of discovery and human kindness, things that make us laugh.
Stories that kind of shrink our world and make us feel more connected.
Subscribe and listen every weekday to The World.
On Living Planet, we've got questions.
Is anyone trying to clean up this mess?
Big questions. Should we really be sinking our money into this?
Questions that get to the bottom of things.
How much CO2 does a tree absorb anyway? Your questions.
How often do you think we should use the reusable cups to compensate for the paper ones?
But don't worry, we've got answers too. Answers to help you navigate some of the biggest environmental issues of our time. That's On Living Planet.
Find us wherever you get podcasts.